Since the first iPhone in 2007, smartphones have completely taken over society, and there have been an abundance of smartphones released over the past 2 decades, a few of which have been great, some terrible, many mediocre, and some just plain strange. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're going to be looking at the top 25 weirdest smartphones ever made. Now, I've done a couple videos on the 25 best-selling smartphones, the 25 worst smartphones, so it only felt right to do the 25 strangest. Now, naturally, there would normally be a lot of crossover from my worst smartphones video into this one. Shocker, a lot of weird phones typically aren't very good. They're too gimmicky, they've got some sort of issue, maybe they push a weird feature like 3D. My last couple videos will be linked in the description if you want to see them after this one, but for the sake of keeping things fresh, these are going to be 25 completely new smartphones, and trust me, some of them are pretty dang strange. Maybe not all of them Kia Ceira Echo strange, but still pretty strange. Also, weirdness is relative, right? So you may not agree with everything on this list. It's not really in any particular order, although I think as we go along, we definitely start to see some more and more strangeness, particularly near the end of this list. But I'm done stalling. Please hit that like button, and let's get started with number 25. Kicking things off at number 25, we have the Motorola Atrix from early 2011. The phone itself at first glance is pretty basic. It was one of the earliest smartphones with 4G capabilities and shipped with Android 2.2 Froyo with that enticingly ugly Moto Blur skin. We're looking at a basic 4-inch TFT display at 540p with the first dual-core Tegra 2 processor and a single gigabyte of RAM powering everything. This was a genuinely powerful device for the time, and it needed to be given the gimmick tying everything together. You see, this phone had some very unique features. Firstly, there was the first ever smartphone fingerprint sensor, long before Apple ever brought Touch ID, so that's pretty cool. Then there's the micro USB and HDMI ports on the side, which allow you to plop this phone onto a dock and turn the thing into a full-fledged computer. Think Samsung DeX for the Galaxy S8, except this ran Motorola's WebTop platform, which was an Ubuntu-based desktop that did its best to integrate the phone's files and software into a more familiar computer experience. There were multiple docks, first the multimedia dock, which was basic and allowed for more accessible HDMI and USB ports. Then we had a laptop dock, or a lap dock as they called it, no joke. It was basically an empty laptop shell for the phone to power, and it would set you back $600. Yeah, you could pay that much money for an empty laptop. Can't help but feel that money would be better spent on just a normal laptop, but I respect them trying to do something unique. The benefit of them having to beef up the phone to make it work as a middling laptop is that the device itself was very powerful for the time, and it seemed to have received glowing reviews outside of the lap dock, which naturally barely sold. There would be future generations of the Atrix as well, but the entire concept of it was flawed from the beginning. It just never made a whole lot of sense to turn your phone into a laptop when you had to bring around the laptop anyways. You might as well just have a separate computer. And a smartphone is so small, it's never going to be as powerful as a regular laptop. All in all, I think this device is definitely worth being considered one of the weirdest smartphones ever made. At number 24 from 2016, we have the Nextbit Robin. Do you remember those Razr phones? There was only a couple of them, and if this phone looks vaguely familiar, it's because it was made by the same team. Nextbit would be bought out by Razr only a year after the Robin released, which had followed a very successful Kickstarter campaign and mostly positive critical reception. The phone's design was already unique enough, being plastic with squared edges and bright colors. It is a very friendly looking device, and I've actually done a video on this phone before. The specs here are fairly straightforward. A 5.2-inch 1080p display, 13 megapixel camera, Snapdragon 808 chipset with 3 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of storage. It was a solid Android phone, and while the design really stood out, it was the cloud-first marketing that makes this device qualify for this list. Now, naturally, having been a Kickstarter phone, coming seemingly out of nowhere, that's already strange enough. Not too many smartphones actually ever pan out when they're crowdfunded to begin with, never mind receive $1.3 million from 3,000 backers. But this phone wanted to tackle a problem: storage space, and its method would be free cloud storage for its purchasers. There were some pretty innovative features here, with the phone optimizing storage by doing things like offloading apps onto the cloud when you're not using them, similar to what even iPhones do these days. The software was clean and the experience was pretty ideal, but when you're trusting a crowd-funded company like this, even one founded by creators with some pedigree in the tech space, you need to be wary. Razr bought out Nextbit in 2017, and 2 years after the phone was released, the Nextbit cloud storage would be shut down completely. Still, this was a cool phone with a very unique design, and I can appreciate the ambition. Strange or not, it was a fun device to be sure. Coming in at number 23 and spanning from 2016 to 2019, we have the Motorola Moto Z line of smartphones, mostly coming down to the Moto Z, Moto Z Force, and Moto Z Play with multiple generations. Z or Z debate aside, these phones at first glance were fairly typical Android flagships you would expect back in 2016, but they're made by Motorola, so good chance there's something weird about them. While the 2016 phones received okay reviews for the most part, the fingerprint sensor looked like a home button but wasn't a home button, which was confusing. The gimmick that was pushed here was modularity, not unlike the LG G5, though unlike that phone, Motorola actually made an attempt to put out more than 2 accessories, as well as multiple phones compatible with their modules. Called Moto Mods, great name, you had accessories that could be magnetically attached to the phone to add functionality, like a bigger speaker, battery pack, or even projector, all of which were hot swappable, unlike the LG G5. Around this time, modularity was a really popular concept, but there were always inherent issues with it. The reality was there's not a ton of super useful things you can attach to your phone in this fashion. I mean, past being able to switch up your phone's look at will. While an attachable battery bank could be useful, it makes the phone unwieldy and certainly not an ideal experience. It's also sort of impractical. Do you really need a JBL Sound Boost Moto mod attached to your Moto Z Force when instead you could take the money spent on the mod itself and purchase a Bluetooth speaker? Sure, kickstand, but look how thick this thing is. It's an absolute unit. Or how about a mod to give you 5G connectivity in 2019? Did anyone actually buy this? And if so, why? Some were cool though, like the Hasselblad camera mod or this Polaroid mod. Honestly, I take it all back, this was pretty neat, and the more mods I look at, the more I like this concept. I feel like it's a more robust version of Apple's MagSafe to an extent. Motorola really tried with Moto Mods, and while they were never particularly popular, you gotta give them credit for going all in. Still, a bit weird this ever existed, especially in smartphones as recent as 2019. At number 22, we have the Asus Pad phone from April 2012, and while conceptually it's certainly not even close to the strangest device we'll see, it still never made a whole lot of sense. On its own, the smartphone seems pretty straightforward and basic. It's got a 4.3-inch 540p display and shipped with Android 4.0 Ice Cream Sandwich. It's a really boring looking phone, but that's the catch. Being a phone is only one aspect of this device, because not unlike what Motorola had attempted with the Atrix, this phone had a companion tablet dock. You had this Pad phone station, which was a 10.1-inch tablet, a very thick tablet that you would stick the phone into, and then you would have a basic Android tablet with an okay at best display. The battery on it was huge at least, but considering this tablet was useless without the phone inside, as in just like that empty laptop shell, this was always going to be a concept doomed to failure. Nobody wants to bring around a tablet that isn't actually a tablet unless you plug your phone into it. If you really loved that concept though, there was also another keyboard attachment to actually turn this thing into sort of a laptop, though the software was still very much Android, rather than the more desktop-oriented experience. Ultimately, what you had here was a pretty mediocre smartphone that made for a frustrating tablet. Things could be inconsistent, going from the phone to the tablet, and the specs weren't enough to really handle this sort of thing. There were actually multiple generations here, and as much as it's easy to mock this concept, it must have had some limited success given how many times Asus tried it. Still, there's a reason this idea has been dead for a decade. It was never really practical to carry around an empty shell to enlarge your smartphone experience. At number 21 from 2011, we have the LG Double Play, the first LG phone on this list, but certainly not the last. The early days of smartphones were truly something special, a time when iPhone was around, but the industry hadn't fully yet accepted that a simple display and no keyboard was the sole path forward. We saw lots of weird takes on how smartphones could work around this time and incorporate physical keyboards, including lots of slider phones, and this was one of them, but there's, a second display down there. Running Android 2.3 Gingerbread, the Double Play featured a main screen that was 3.5 inches and not exactly the highest quality. The second, sharper screen was 2 inches, and it was there to allow for easier multitasking, at least in theory. You had shortcuts to a select number of apps, 9 apps. You had your choice of 9 apps that you could put on here. Apps that were specifically made to run on the tiny screen, things like messaging, music, notes, and emails. This was a fairly useless gimmick with very little room for customizability or true multitasking, and it also made the physical keypad more cramped, making it potentially less ideal for the audience this would have generally appealed to. The build was really chunky and cheap feeling, and the compromises here to get that second screen just never were going to be worth it for the very little added functionality achieved. This wasn't the last phone that attempted to incorporate a second screen that we'll see on this list, and there's no question it was strange. Even if I kinda dig the look of the phone for some reason, I think I'm just a sucker for gimmicky devices, and that is exactly what this is. At number 20 from 2003, we have the Nokia 3650, or the 3600 in North America. This phone had a lot of firsts. It was the first phone with an integrated camera to be announced for the North American market, and the first in America was Symbian OS, an operating system featured on a multitude of early smartphones. While it's easy to call practically any phone prior to the iPhone in 2007 weird relative to what we expect from a smartphone today, this one stands out for its circular rotary style keypad that I guess was supposed to make texting easier somehow, but unsurprisingly all it really did was confuse people. The camera was a mind-blowing 0.3 megapixels, and the phone was probably pretty cool at the time if you could wrap your head around the keypad. Don't forget how these things worked back in the day. If you wanted to type, you had to hit these buttons multiple times to get a letter. Let's just say I'm sure this would have been more difficult to get used to than a QWERTY keypad or even just a regular cell phone one. The phone would be replaced 8 months after it launched by a revised model with a more straightforward keypad, and that was probably a far better experience for users back in the day. I wanted to at least mention this phone because I do find the rotary concept kind of interesting. Apple themselves had actually prototyped the smartphone with an iPod-style click wheel, not unlike the joke image Steve Jobs had showed in the original iPhone presentation. And one has to wonder how something like that could have panned out. I don't think it would have been good, and this phone is a solid example of exactly why. It was just weird to use. At number 19 from 2014, we have the Neptune Pine, our second Kickstarter smartphone that isn't so much a smartphone as it is a smartwatch. Yeah, that was basically the concept, a smartwatch that could act as a standalone smartphone with a micro SIM card slot, a dual-core Qualcomm Snapdragon processor, half a gigabyte of RAM, and 16 or 32 gigs of internal storage. The display was 2.4 inches, and we even had a 5 megapixel rear camera along with a VGA quality front-facing camera. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, this really was a smartphone running Android 4.1 Jelly Bean. Within 27 hours of the campaign launching, Neptune had hit their goal of $100,000 and ended up raising over $800K in 30 days, which made for the highest funding of any Canadian Kickstarter at the time. You could detach the Pine from the wristband to become, I guess, a little easier to use as a smartphone, but if you're already squinting your eyes skeptically, I can't blame you. This was never really a good idea, but don't forget, while smartphones by 2013 to 2014 were fairly well established, smartwatches were still a new and foreign concept. The Apple Watch hadn't been announced yet, and there was a gap in the market for a product potentially like this to really take off. And I mean, well, there was never a second model, so you can probably guess how it went. The battery was small, the camera quality was mediocre, both the device and even watch band itself was clunky. Android 4.1 was already out of date at launch, performance was middling at best. Look, if you ever used a lower end Android from the early 2010s, just imagine that experience on a 2.4-inch display. Yeah, not great, and the biggest claim to fame for this device was probably being featured in 2017's Fast and Furious 8 for some reason. Overall, weird smartphone and not a great smartwatch, but still, someone had to give it a shot, and Canadians have never done anything wrong in the history of the universe, so I guess I give the Pine a score of 91 Canadian geese out of 19 double-doubles. That sentence hurt to say. This is a stupid joke. At number 18 from 2015, we have the BlackBerry Priv, which is one of many BlackBerry phones that could probably qualify for this list. At first glance, it looks like your typical 2015 Android phone. We've got a nice 5.4-inch 1440p AMOLED display that's actually curved on the sides, pretty cool, up to Android 6 Marshmallow, an impressive 18 megapixel rear camera, a Snapdragon 808 chipset, and 3 gigs of RAM. This is a slick looking phone front to back, and the curved screen really makes it feel premium. But this is a BlackBerry, and when you think BlackBerry, you think keyboard. And sure enough, we've got a physical keyboard here on a slider. While slider smartphones were a dime a dozen in the early days, the Priv stands out for being from 2015. And I actually love this phone. I did a video on it years ago, and I'm probably going to do another one, because forget the device itself, the keyboard is just way too fun to fidget with. In, out, in, out, in, out. This was actually BlackBerry's first Android phone, as they'd been using their own operating system beforehand. It had security enhancements, and it was a lot more appealing than their prior models, thanks to actually having access to the Google Play Store. Though the audience for a physical keyboard was extremely small even by 2015. Still, the keyboard actually does feel great to use, and it has some neat functionality like being swipeable, so you can do some gestures without actually touching the screen. The name Priv was said to stand for privilege and privacy, and it definitely was priced on the higher end, which probably didn't help with it failing to meet sales expectations, though it wasn't really a flop per se either. The biggest issue with these sliders is that you're using a significant amount of space for a gimmick that doesn't appeal to that many people to begin with, and this would mean compromise in other areas. Plus, with a physical mechanism like this, there's always potential for getting dust and debris inside and causing issues down the line. This wouldn't be BlackBerry's last hurrah, though their Key 1 and Key 2 wouldn't see much more success. I love this phone, but there's no question it's pretty strange, and there's unfortunately a reason BlackBerry doesn't make phones anymore. At number 17 from 2011, we have the aptly named Pantech Pocket, another relatively early smartphone that was attempting to evolve hardware in a unique direction. Specifically, the Pocket was wider than almost any phone on the market, not taller, mind you, but wider, making for this sort of square-ish design. Thing is, there's a reason phones got taller rather than wider as time went on. It's because it still lets them be relatively easy to hold with one hand. And sure enough, the 3:4 ratio of the 4-inch 600p TFT display was apparently clunky and uncomfortable to actually use, at least if you had smaller hands. The design here is sort of interesting. You've got that textured, rubbery plastic backing, and the software features Pantech's own skin on top of Android 2.3 Gingerbread. Pantech was a South Korean company that generally made more budget-oriented devices, and this one clearly was meant to stand out from the crowd. And it does, though I'm not sure it's for the right reasons. Also, fun fact, while I did find a Wikipedia article for this phone, it was specifically only on Wikipedia Netherlands. Not sure why, maybe the Dutch really like this phone, but the article, just like this phone, is so short anyways, I don't think it really matters. At number 16 from 2005, we have the Nokia N90. Thus far, we've only had one smartphone from the pre-iPhone days, but that's not for lack of choice. As said, most old phones feel foreign to some extent by nature of the entire industry being in its infancy. But even compared to other phones at the time, there's no question the N90 stands out. Or perhaps swivels out would be the correct phrasing. Yeah, so the design here allows the phone to swivel in basically 4 modes, even allowing for what was essentially a handheld camcorder. There's 2 displays, and the N90 could almost be mistaken for a flip phone if you didn't see the big camera lens that could also be swiveled. The main display was 2.1 inches and surprisingly high resolution for the time, and the phone was all powered by Symbian OS as you would expect. The camera here was 2 megapixels, which sounds unimpressive now, but for some perspective, the first iPhone 2 years later would also have 2 megapixels and no video recording capability, meaning this phone, as far as the cameras go, was actually more versatile. And the phone's cool and all, but it was also expensive and big and heavy and just all around chunky. It wasn't the future of smartphones, but it was a unique idea, and I can't help but kind of want one. Yet another innovative device from Nokia that never really went anywhere, but is still cool looking back. In 15th place, released 2013, we have the LG G Flex. There's plenty of LG devices that could make this list if I really wanted them to, and this one certainly deserves it. The LG G Flex was an Android phablet that was very similar to the LG G2, except it had the unique quirk of featuring a flexible display, allowing for the entire device to be curved. The screen itself was OLED 6 inches and a kind of low-res 720p. The shell was polycarbonate plastic, with the buttons placed on the back of the phone right below the camera, classic LG design. Apparently, the rear backing is self-healing, meaning the coating can apparently repair minor abrasions. Yeah, this phone is weird for more than just the screen, although that is definitely the aspect that stands out the most. There's a problem with phones like this that push a singular gimmick over everything else. The big question of why. Why should you buy this? If that gimmick isn't going to directly improve the experience in a way noticeable to the consumer, it's not going to be worth it, especially when the price needs to be high to allow for the gimmick to exist in the first place. The screen itself was a bit fuzzy looking compared to the 1080p LCD of the G2, and the fact that it was curved didn't make that compromise worth it. Sure, the technology's cool, but is it actually going to be that much more comfortable in the hand to the point that it's worth purchasing over any other phone at a more reasonable price? This was a proof of concept more than anything, and from that lens, the LG G Flex definitely looks better. Finally, this phone even managed to be weird down to its marketing. I'm not going to go into this commercial, but it was called the worst commercial for a smartphone ever by TechCrunch, and that sentiment would be repeated by other publications.
I love garlic.
Oh, really?
It's weird. Everything is weird. Though the phone, I think, is still a pretty cool proof of concept for the time. Also, shout out to the 2013 Samsung Galaxy Round, which had a similar concept but was also just a more well-rounded device, pun very much intended. It also only released in South Korea, which is why you probably have never heard of it until now. In 14th place from 2013, we have the Yoda phone, a smartphone made by the Russian company Yoda that featured a second display on the back of the device. Specifically, this was an e-ink display, same as what you would expect from a Kindle e-reader. There's a lot of weirdness with this phone in general, but let's start with the basics. From the front, this was standard Android stuff, a 4.3-inch 720p LCD screen running Android 4.2 Jelly Bean. From the back, you had the 4.3-inch 360p e-ink display, which was there to, well, give you a second display. The idea here was that the second display could be used while the main phone was off, giving basic information and functions, or even acting as an e-reader if you wanted it to. Around this time, there was a growing movement of users who were already realizing how much attention smartphones were taking up in daily life, and having a simpler, more basic display was seen as an opportunity to help limit getting sucked into using your phone. It was easier on the eyes, and you can see notifications without opening your phone like you normally would. It could also be always on, and in theory would take up very little battery life, especially compared to the regular display. There would ultimately be 2 more generations of the Yotaphone before the company filed for bankruptcy in 2019. This was just far too niche of an idea to ever be successful, but you've got to respect the attempt to make something different. Coming in at number 13 from 2013, we have the Samsung Galaxy S4 Zoom. Not the regular S4, which was very much a normal flagship. There's a lot to like with this phone, but it's obvious where the big gimmick comes in: the built-in zoom lens, which gives the device the appearance of basically a classic digital camera. There was even a grip and a shutter button. The lens made for a 10 times optical zoom, which is still pretty impressive to this day, and the camera sensor itself was 16 megapixels, capable of taking video in up to 1080p at 30 frames per second. This was basically a lower to more mid-range digital camera, but also of course a smartphone with all the benefits that come with that. The display was downgraded, however, being a 540p 4.3-inch AMOLED versus the sharper 1080p 5-inch AMOLED on the regular S4. You were basically trading off the better display and far sleeker build for a more robust camera and a whole lot of bulk. This thing is chunky, and it was basically like having a digital camera in your pocket, something people were often trying to specifically avoid by buying a smartphone in the first place. Thing is, digital cameras had been ridiculously popular throughout the 2000s, but they were basically killed off fully by smartphones. In 2013, phones already had cameras good enough that the convenience made up for any drawback in quality. The mentality often was, when people saw this phone, if I want to bring a camera around, I'll just bring a camera around alongside my phone. 1 year later, we also saw the Galaxy K Zoom release, which was a similar concept, and there were some Galaxy cameras as well that made more sense, being actual proper cameras that also just so happened to run Android. Overall, Galaxy S4 Zoom is pretty awesome and I want one, but they're quite expensive on eBay, and there's a reason they didn't stick around. Also, shout out to the 41 megapixel Nokia Lumia 1020. It didn't have the same zoom lens, but it does look kind of similar. Cool phone. Alright, we've now reached the halfway mark of this list, or a little over that actually. Hope you're enjoying the video. Please hit like if you haven't already. These videos take far too long to make. Turns out getting 25 new smartphones I hadn't already talked about in that worst smartphones ever video, not an easy task. I know, shocking, right? It would have been far easier if I just cheated and used a bunch of phones from that list, but that's okay. We don't need to talk about the Galaxy Beam, which was a smartphone slash projector combo, or the Samsung Continuum. Yeah, there's actually a lot of strange Samsung phones from the early years. I did want to give a shout out though to the real obscure phones like the ZTE Z20, I think. It's a phone I was sent years ago, and it had a second screen on the back of the phone, like a full display, not like the Yotaphone with an e-reader display, but like just a normal touchscreen on the back of the phone, because why not, I guess. I almost put I think the Oppo Find X on this, and that was a pretty cool phone, and there's just lots of really weird smartphones that could make this list and aren't going to, but I still hope you're enjoying it, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get right back into this with the top 12 weirdest smartphones of all time. At number 12 from 2024, believe it or not, we have the Huawei Mate X-T Ultimate. Over the past half-decade, we've seen plenty of folding phones, some of which were disasters, but as a whole, foldables have gotten much better, especially in recent years. A phone like the Galaxy Fold is arguably already weird on its own. Certainly the concept was novel when it came out originally, but at this point, I think we're all pretty used to this sort of device. So how do you shake things up once again? How about a tri-folding phone? The Huawei Mate X-T has the unique quirk of not just unfolding once, but twice, so you basically get 3 smartphone displays connected into one big tablet. It's a really cool concept, and while the clearly iOS-inspired software skin may not be the most ideal, the hardware is still very impressive. The phone works in 3 modes: as a single screen, as a more normal size foldable, and then you can unfold it one more time for that ultimate tablet experience. It doesn't exactly look normal from the back either, with this huge camera setup featuring a 50 megapixel main shooter alongside a 12 megapixel ultrawide and telephoto. Price-wise, you're looking at around $3,000 US. Not that you'll be able to actually buy this in the US, given that it's from Huawei. Overall, at the moment at least, this is a very novel phone. It remains to be seen whether or not these tri-fold phones ever actually catch on, in which case, like foldables of the past, this will no longer be that weird, but for now at least, I think the Mate X-T deserves a spot on this list. At number 11 from 2016, we have the Caterpillar Cat S60, and I'm not sure if I knew that CAT stood for Caterpillar before this, to be honest. I feel like I probably should have known that, but it's worth a single eyebrow raise, I think. As you would expect from CAT, this was basically the definition of a rugged smartphone, a device built for anything, and I do mean anything. Aside from having a weird, bulky build, it was also the most waterproof phone ever at the time, and also the first phone to ever have a built-in thermal imaging camera, which is extremely cool. There have been a good few CAT phones over the years, and this wouldn't be the only one to include a thermal imaging camera, but for a feature phone like this with such a niche gimmick to even exist, for those this appealed to, this was the absolute perfect smartphone, and there was nothing else quite like it on the market. Ultimately, the last CAT phone would come out in 2023, with the phone maker shutting down in early 2024. These devices still have a level of demand though, and having something like that thermal camera, normally you would need a dedicated device for that, which could cost upwards of thousands of dollars. Just having that feature means this phone will continue to retain relevance for users as long as it still turns on and functions. Weird phone, but I kind of love it. At number 10 from 2014, we have the Sharp Aquos Crystal. Anyone remember this phone? It was arguably more of a concept device rather than one truly built to sell, but it was still extremely impressive by 2014 standards. The phone was very plain from the back with only a single 8-megapixel camera sensor, but from the front, we're looking at a nearly bezel-less display along the top and sides, with only a big bottom bezel hosting the selfie camera and microphone. Note, there's no speaker for phone calls, which normally would be on the top bezel. This phone uses an odd in-ear sound wave receiver, which channels sound waves to your inner ear, thus avoiding any need for a proper speaker at the top of the phone. This isn't unique to this device, but it's still very uncommon, and apparently the quality was mostly lacking here from the reviews I've read. Basically, while this phone looked cool, it's not one you would want to actually use if you made a lot of phone calls. This was still very much a mid-range smartphone despite its futuristic design. The 5-inch display is only 720p, pretty rough for 2014, and the rest of the specs were just as middling. It was also priced in the mid-range, at least however, which isn't what you would expect from a decade-old phone that looks like this. I would argue being from Sharp in the first place is kind of weird. You don't really think of them when it comes to smartphones, but they have made plenty of them over the years. Overall, very cool proof of concept, and certainly a phone deserving of this list. At number 9 from also 2014, we have the Vertu Signature Touch. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but whatever. It was a phone that would cost you the meager price of around 11,000 US dollars. No, really, 11 grand for this thing. The design was very luxurious, as you would expect, with classy materials like titanium, genuine leather, and sapphire. I would also say the design is a bit much. Clearly, Vertu doesn't follow the Apple mentality of minimalism, though if you're spending 11 grand, I don't suppose you'd want them to. The actual specs are fairly standard for a flagship smartphone of its era. Snapdragon 801 processor, 4.7-inch 1080p display, 13-megapixel camera. The build is thick and heavy, and there were plenty of different finishes to choose from, including a blue lizard skin option apparently. And this is all well and good, but clearly none of it amounts to a smartphone worth so much cash, and that's where the main gimmick comes into play. These days, AI personal assistants are much more relevant and more useful than they've ever been, but they still can't actually replace a human. But with the Signature Touch, you get Vertu's concierge service, which amounted to 24/7 access to a real human who could essentially act as your assistant, able to do things like make restaurant reservations, or high-end exclusive bookings or purchases you may not have had the means to do by yourself. Of course, you're still bankrolling all of this, but the service would come free for a year with the purchase of the phone, and it would cost $3,000 annually afterwards. Having constant access to a human capable of doing the dirty work an AI might struggle with is an interesting proposition, and one I find dumb, and definitely not worth 11 grand. But then again, I'm making YouTube videos for a living, while the actual owners of these phones, assuming anyone bought them, are probably much better off. So you think I could get one of these assistants to write a video script for me? I kind of wonder, but regardless, extremely weird phone with a weirder backstory behind it, and it all makes for a perfect fit as one of the weirdest smartphones ever made. At number 8 from 2018, we have the Palm phone. And this really is a weird one, both for the history behind it as well as the device itself. If you know smartphone history at all, you'll probably recognize the Palm name, and you may be aware Palm hadn't made any devices branded after them since 2010. And yet in 2018, here's this tiny little device popping out of nowhere, promising to be an ultra-mobile companion used in conjunction with your main driving smartphone. The hope here was to capitalize on those who wanted to distance themselves from how much time they spend on their phone, while still having a device they could bring around with them anywhere. The size is what stands out the most, with a tiny 3.3-inch 720p LCD display. Not ideal for your actual smartphone, but as a companion piece it might make sense. Other specs were fairly standard: USB-C, IP68 water resistance, 12 megapixel rear camera. Power was limited with a Snapdragon 435 chip and only 3 gigs of RAM, but considering the aim of this phone, that was no surprise. And it was all capped off with Android 8.1 Oreo. Look, this phone had some neat ideas, but the problem with a companion smartphone like this is that it just doesn't make sense for hardly anybody. It's not good enough to be a main driving smartphone, but it's not dumb enough for someone who wants to give up smartphones altogether. It sat somewhere in the middle, and while that may have appealed to some niche groups, I don't think it's particularly surprising there were never any more generations of this device. The website palm.com is about as bare bones as it can possibly be, with no buy page anywhere. The phone is now 6 years old, but you would think it was brand new looking at this site. Ultimately, this was a strange phone from a dead brand, but sort of a cool piece in smartphone history. And at number 7 from 2003, we have the Nokia 7600. This is another weirdly shaped smartphone, and actually was only Nokia's second 3G cell phone. Mind you, 3G was a very new thing around 2003. Even the first iPhone from 07 only supported 2G networks for some perspective. But 3G is not what makes this phone weird, nor is it Nokia's Series 40 software platform. No, what makes the 7600 stand out is the design, which looks more like a teardrop-shaped fashion accessory than a practical device. With a 2-inch display in the center and a keypad split on either side, typing on this phone was unique, to say in the least. Each hand had to work separately on opposite sides of the screen, making texting a bit of a challenge. It was compact, which was a plus, but that unconventional layout left for a lot to be desired in terms of usability. On the hardware side, you had a VGA quality camera, which was somewhat of a luxury for 2003, and the display was actually fairly vibrant for the time. The 7600's battery life was solid, and the phone was apparently fairly durable. Shocking, it is from Nokia after all. But holding this device up to your face to make a phone call, yeah, just doesn't look or feel like any other phone out there, and was weird even by Nokia's already experimental standards. Ultimately, the Nokia 7600 might not have been a mainstream hit, but it left an impression as one of their boldest designs. It's a quirky relic of a different time, and for that, it earns its spot on this list. At number 6, we have the Energizer Power Max P18K Pop from 2019. What a mouthful. And yes, that Energizer. The P18K Pop housed a massive 18,000 mAh battery, which was unheard of at the time and honestly still is. For some perspective, the very big iPhone 16 Pro Max has 4,685 mAh. Yeah, compare that to 18,000. So Energizer was aiming to create a phone that could last for literal days without charging, and it did. The P18K Pop could reportedly play music non-stop for over 100 hours and stay in standby for nearly 50 days. Was this impressive? Yeah, absolutely. Was it practical? No. With all that battery power came a serious drawback. The phone was huge and looked more like a portable power bank with a screen than a traditional smartphone. It was a brick in the hand and probably wasn't going to fit too well in your pocket. Now, on the hardware side, it was a fairly standard Android phone for 2019 with a 6.2-inch display, 6 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of storage, and a dual pop-up selfie camera, hence the name Pop in its name. Yeah, this had a motorized selfie camera, of course it did. Specs are fine, but the phone is so big, who cares? This is so impractical, you would never want to actually use this thing. And at the end of the day, the P18K Pop went down as an experiment in how far battery life could be pushed before there was a complete breakdown of the phone's practicality. While there was some potential to the idea of having a massive Energizer battery, the execution here was terrible, and the phone is more of a joke than anything else. It is a phone that people remember, but probably not for good reasons. At number 5, we have the Motorola MPX from 2004, also known as, I believe, the MPX 300. The MPX was Motorola's ambitious attempt to merge a PDA, that's a personal digital assistant, with a smartphone in a unique dual-hinge design. This phone flipped open horizontally like a mini laptop, revealing a full QWERTY keyboard, and it could also be rotated vertically to be used as a standard flip phone. It was like having two devices in one, with the flexibility to type emails or browse the internet in landscape mode, and then take calls in portrait mode. out. For 2004, this approach was fairly ahead of its time, considering we do rotate our phones regularly now, and there's a lot of promise here. The specs were also ambitious, with a 2.8-inch color touchscreen, yes, a touchscreen with a 1.3 megapixel camera, and Windows Mobile 2003 as the operating system. The software might look pretty ancient, but at the time it offered surprisingly robust functionality, letting users run apps, check emails, and even view documents. However, the potential for the MPX was always going to be restricted by the hardware of the time. It had just 32 megabytes of RAM and ran on a 200 megahertz processor. Still, specs or actual practicality of using a device like this aside, what makes it really stand out from the crowd was the sheer ambition of the design. The double-hinged mechanism was an engineering feat, but it was also fragile, leading to durability issues. Motorola aimed to create a productivity powerhouse. While the MPX was certainly ahead of its time, it was too ahead of its time, bogged down by underpowered hardware and just the general limitations of early mobile tech. All in all, another weird phone that I kind of like the more I see it. At number 4 from 2014, we have the BlackBerry Passport. Now, given my rule of not reusing any phones from my past worst phones video, there's a good few Blackberries I probably could have talked about and just didn't for this list. And while the Passport I don't think is the weirdest thing to ever come from BlackBerry, it is still pretty strange, and I think it deserves to be here. I mean, just look at it. By 2014, BlackBerry was fighting to stay relevant, and the Passport was their bold, unusual response. This phone is essentially a square, with a 4.5-inch 1:1 aspect ratio display that immediately set it apart. Gives me some Pantech Pocket vibes. BlackBerry pitched this as the ultimate productivity phone, with the now wide screen allowing for users to see more of their documents, emails, and spreadsheets without constant scrolling. It was like holding a tiny square tablet that just so happened to make phone calls. Of course, being BlackBerry, the Passport also had a physical keyboard, and like with the next year's Priv, it allowed for basic touch gestures as well as the expected typing. The keyboard itself was a love it or hate it feature. Hardcore BlackBerry fans loved the tactile typing experience, while others found it cramped and clunky for a phone this wide. The Passport specs were actually solid for the time, with a 1440p display, a Snapdragon 801 processor, 3 gigs of RAM, and a 13 megapixel camera. But the phone ran on BlackBerry OS X, which was already practically dead in the water. There was little reason to buy a phone that couldn't keep up with the massive app ecosystems of Android and iOS. These inherent limitations made the Passport less than appealing for most users, who would be more focused on app availability than widescreen email browsing. Ultimately, the BlackBerry Passport stood out for its unconventional approach to productivity. It was a serious, business-oriented device that felt nostalgic even when it was brand new. It's a phone that never found a mainstream audience, but to this day, it's still an icon for die-hard BlackBerry fans, as well as those of us who just enjoy some unusual tech. In third place, from 2004, we have the Sierra Wireless Voke, the first and last smartphone from the company. The Voke was Sierra Wireless's ambitious attempt to break into the smartphone market with a device that would appeal to business users and frequent emailers. At first glance, it looked like a typical candy bar phone of the early 2000s, with a numeric keypad on the front and a small display. But the big gimmick here was hidden in plain sight. Flip the front of the phone open, and you would reveal a full QWERTY keyboard tucked inside. This quirky design gave users a full typing experience without sacrificing the compact size of a regular phone, or at least so Sierra Wireless would have you believe. On the software side, the Voke ran Windows Mobile 2003, which gave it some decent flexibility for email, documents, and other work-related tasks for the time. It also featured a dedicated Voke Mail email service that promised to make checking messages on the go faster and more reliable, a novel feature in the early days of mobile email. The phone had 48 megabytes of RAM and a 200 megahertz processor, not exactly blazing fast, but functional enough to handle basic productivity tasks. Unfortunately, despite the unique design, the Voke struggled to compete. The dual keypad layout was clever, but ultimately awkward to use, with the tiny QWERTY keyboard requiring some serious finger gymnastics. It was also thick and heavy, a trade-off for its dual functionality that never paid off. Battery life was another issue, as Windows Mobile was pretty power demanding, and you didn't have the room in this phone to have a larger battery to compensate. In the end, the Voke was a fascinating experiment in early smartphone design, but I can't say I'm particularly surprised it flopped, and without a doubt, it qualifies as one of the strangest smartphones ever, both for the device itself as well as the company who made it. Sierra Wireless, really, okay, why not? And now, our runner-up for the weirdest smartphone ever from 2023, the Honor V Purse. Okay, so firstly, getting to this point was pretty tough. I found it pretty hard to put certain phones ranked higher than other ones, especially when we're nearing the end of this list. We've had a lot of strange phones, many of which are debatably far weirder than this one, really. But for me, the big differentiator is that a lot of these early smartphones like the Voke, yeah, they are super weird, but they were also made at a time when there was no consensus on what a smartphone was or how the industry would continue to evolve. Something like the Motorola Atrix was an odd experiment, sure, but one that sort of made sense to try out within the context of 2011. I'd say by 2015 or so, smartphones had already been pretty well established in terms of what they were and how they would continue to improve. So for a phone as recent as 2023 to be this out there, well, I would call that pretty dang weird. So this is the Honor V Purse, a foldable smartphone described by the CEO as a Fi digital fashion statement. I believe combining the words physical and digital for Fi digital. But yeah, this is a foldable smartphone that is meant to be held and carried like a purse. It's surprisingly thin and compact given what it is, and has a large, vibrant 90Hz OLED screen that looks great. Everything about this phone is just so strange. This whole bar thing that holds the cameras, as well as holding the chain, and how it unfolds downwards, genuinely kind of like opening an actual purse. There are various chains and straps and accessories to mix and match to really fit the V Purse with the rest of your style, which is exactly what I'm looking for in a smartphone personally. What I really don't get about this is, sure, okay, we're trying to combine fashion accessories with smartphones. I mean, the Vertu Signature Touch arguably did something kind of similar. It was so expensive. You're bringing that around, you definitely want to show it off. But for this to be like a purse and to be carried as a purse, like this is really weird when you think about it. You have a smartphone on a chain that you loop through your arm and carry around like you would a purse. Now, as a man, obviously I don't bring my purse out very often, just on special occasions, so this isn't exactly for me, but isn't the whole point of a purse to carry stuff? Like, isn't that what they do, generally speaking? Your wallet, keys, and whatever other junk women put in purses. Your phone can't do any of that, so if you're gonna bring this around with you, are you just not gonna bring a purse? Are you gonna wear your phone as well as a purse? Like, I don't know what the end game is here, and how many women would actually want to do this. It's so pointless. And just so what, you can show off your smartphone? Nerds like me, sure, I would be very impressed, but most people, like, they would probably just think it's strange. And that basically describes the phone in general. You'll note I haven't really talked about the specs or any of that because I don't think it matters. It's just the concept as a whole, particularly coming from 2023, that really sets this phone apart for me. All in all, as a China-only smartphone, there's very little chance something like this could ever get actually popular. It's an interesting idea maybe, but I also think it's just frankly silly. Without a doubt, the Honor V Purse is one of the weirdest smartphones ever made, although I could see at least somebody out there finding it appealing. And in first place from the prehistoric year of 2020, we have the LG Wing, the final LG flagship smartphone ever made before they shut down their phone division altogether. At first glance, it might look normal enough, but well, it's clearly not. It's called the Wing for a reason, and yeah, the main 6.8-inch 1080p display can be rotated like a wing to the top, making a T shape, and then you've got that smaller 3.9-inch, also 1080p secondary screen making up the bottom part. The phone features 5G networking, the Snapdragon 765G processor and 8 gigs of RAM, a 64 megapixel main camera sensor alongside a couple ultra-wides, and expandable memory, which is nice to see. If the whole rotating thing wasn't weird enough for you, we also have a motorized 32 megapixel pop-up camera, because of course we do. In fairness, we haven't seen too many motorized pop-up cameras on this list. We had the Energizer one, and I think that's it, right? Only seems right to finish off with one. This phone kind of feels like the LG smartphone team knew their time was running out and just decided to make the most ridiculously over-the-top smartphone ever because why not? Like, they just had a bunch of money to spend and were like, okay, well, we're going under already, we might as well have some fun with our final phone. Mind you, this wasn't actually the final LG smartphone. There were some more mid-range and budget models that came out, but for all intents and purposes, this basically was their last hurrah, in the very least their final flagship, their final good phone, if you will. If we look at this a little more critically, it's so strange by every possible metric. And I think the real question is why? Why would this be useful? There are so few use cases that I can think of where this swivel functionality would actually make your experience better. Perhaps for filming or taking photos, sure. They have this gimbal mode feature where you could get smoother video, and they obviously put a lot of time into the cameras and making those good, but beyond that, there doesn't seem to be much utilization of the unique design. Sure, 2 screens at once does give you a lot of options, but is it truly worth the form factor? And also, is it just me, or is this kind of a redo of their double play from, a decade earlier? While it's simple enough to grasp what makes this phone unique, unique. I think what truly puts it over the top on strangeness really is the fact that this was LG's last flagship smartphone entry. While they've had a lot of problems with their phones over the years, with notoriously unreliable hardware and boot looping affecting far too many devices, LG is huge. Never as omnipresent in the market as, say, Samsung, but they were very much a cornerstone of the Android industry. But over time, sales just kept declining, and without any real innovation or proper shakeups, LG smartphones became no longer profitable to continue making, I would expect, otherwise why would they shut them down? The LG Wing is quite frankly unhinged, or unswiveled might be the proper phrasing, I don't know. I absolutely love just how crazy the team went with this, and I think the phone really has earned being considered the weirdest of all time in sort of a good way. For myself, I have it at number 1, and given it is somehow the culmination of LG's entire smartphone history, who expected the LG Double Play and LG G Flex to lead to this phone? Oh wait, maybe this does make some sense. Anyways, all things considered, I think the LG Wing has earned the top spot on this list. And with that, I think we're right about done here. Man, this was quite the video. It was difficult to put this list together, not being able to use phones I've already talked about. And I also found just ranking everything somewhat difficult. Like, should the Honor V Purse really be at number 2? I don't know. But yeah, this was fun, so I hope you enjoyed the video. And if so, please hit that like button if you haven't, and subscribe too. I have socials I don't use, but you should follow me anyways. Huge shout out to the channel members for being amazing people. Thank you so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.